This story isn't about the food, it's about the bill and who was going to pay. And I don't mean with a credit card. When the hostess at the ledge asked if I had a reservation, I just pointed to the best table in the house, the one where my husband was sitting. No, I said, but I'll be joining them. Do you know that feeling when you realize your marriage didn't die from a gunshot, but from a $200 lobster cocktail you never even got to taste? My name is Sloane. I'm 38 years old, and my entire career is built on one skill: seeing the truth behind the image. As a brand strategist, I dismantle facades for a living. I find the rot under the new logo. Tonight, I was just trying to be a wife. I'd come to the ledge, a place so exclusive it feels like it's carved from glacial ice and pretension, to surprise Mark. This was supposed to be our makeup dinner, the one I'd been trying to schedule for 3 weeks, a desperate attempt to put a patch on the slow leak our marriage had become. Mark, my 41-year-old husband, the brilliant architect at Ethelredge and Thorne Design, had been distant, crushing it on the new project, he'd said. I wanted to believe him. I saw him the moment I stepped past the ridiculous 3-story water feature in the lobby. He was at a VIP booth, the one with the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. He wasn't alone. He was with Chloe, his new executive assistant. Chloe, who was barely 24 and wore her ambition like a perfume so strong it made your eyes water. They weren't talking about blueprints. My breath caught, sharp and cold in my chest. His hand was on the table, palm up. Her hand was in his. They were sharing the volcanic chocolate torte, a ridiculous overpriced dessert meant for 2 people who were celebrating something. They were laughing, not a polite, professional laugh. It was the intimate, head-tilted, private joke laugh that used to be mine. He was looking at her with the same intensity he'd once used to sketch our dream house on a cocktail napkin. My training kicked in. The wife receded. The strategist took over. You never charge into a negotiation. You never show your hand. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I knew, from years of boardroom battles, that my expression would settle into one of cool, detached interest. I took one deep, calibrated breath. I walked to the hostess stand, my heels silent on the plush carpet. The young woman looked up, her smile practiced. A table for one. I smiled back, a weapon I'd perfected. Actually, I see my party, but I'd prefer my own table. That one would be perfect. I pointed to the small, empty 2-top directly adjacent to Mark's VIP booth. It was so close I could read the label on their wine bottle. The hostess hesitated, clearly recognizing the power dynamic I was creating. Ma'am, that table is perfect, I repeated, my voice dropping just enough to imply this was not a request. She seated me. I slid into the chair, my back to them, but the polished obsidian wall next to me reflected the entire scene like a dark mirror. I watched him feed her a bite of the torte. A wave of nausea, acidic and hot, rose in my throat. I ordered a glass of water, just as I was cataloging the precise shade of lipstick Chloe had left on her wine glass. A third woman approached their table. Mark and Chloe scrambled to their feet, their body language shifting instantly from intimate to obsequious. I went perfectly still. I didn't need the dark reflection to know who it was. I had studied that face for weeks, preparing Mark for the pitch of his life. It was Eleanor Vance, the real estate titan. The woman whose face graced the cover of Forbes last month under the headline, "The Matriarch of the Modern Skyline." Eleanor Vance, the sole investor Mark's firm was desperately courting for the $500 million River North project, the project Ethelredge and Thorne had bet its entire future on. A cold, sharp click sounded in my brain, the final piece of data locking into place. Chloe, Vance, Eleanor Vance. Chloe was not his assistant. Chloe was his leverage. Chloe was Eleanor's daughter. My profession isn't just about strategy, it's about timing. I stood up, picking up my clutch. I took the few steps toward their table, a path that led directly to the ladies' room. As I passed, my hand loosened. and my small, beaded evening bag slipped from my grasp, landing squarely at the foot of Mark's chair. I stopped. Oh, how clumsy of me. Mark looked down, then he looked up. The blood didn't just drain from his face, it evaporated. He looked like he'd seen a ghost in a tailored silk blouse. Chloe's eyes, bright and hard, narrowed in undisguised contempt. "Mark, darling," I said, my voice warm, projecting just enough for the surrounding tables. "I had no idea you had a meeting here, too. I was just grabbing a quiet bite by myself." I bent slowly to retrieve my bag, then straightened, turning my full attention to the matriarch. "And Mrs. Vance," I said, extending a hand. "What an honor. I'm Sloane, Mark's wife." I watched the three of them, Mark's raw animal panic, Chloe's insolent, spoiled fury. And Eleanor Vance was different. Her eyes were cold, not with anger, but with pure Arctic calculation. She was assessing me, a new variable, a potential threat. I held her gaze for 1 second longer than was comfortable, then gave a tight, professional smile. "Please, don't let me interrupt your work." I walked back to my table, every vertebra aligned. I sat down. When the waiter rushed over, I waved away the water menu. "Bring me your most expensive bottle of champagne," I said. "Just 1 glass." When it arrived, I raised the flute, the bubbles catching the light. I didn't look at their dark reflection. I turned my chair slightly, looked directly at their table, and toasted them. Mark was frozen. Chloe was glaring. Eleanor was watching me. The game was on. I didn't go home to cry. I didn't smash a single wedding photo. I walked past the master bedroom we shared, down the hall to my home office, and locked the door. My entire career is built on dismantling false narratives, on finding the weakness in an opponent's brand. My specialization is opposition research. Tonight, the opposition was my husband. My fingers were steady on the keyboard. I didn't look at his Facebook page. I didn't look at her Instagram. That's the curated lie. I went straight for the truth. I used my corporate credentials to run a full, deep dive background check on one Chloe Vance. Her employment history was a joke, a predictable trail of failed internships and ghost positions at companies her mother, Eleanor, had invested in. She wasn't an executive assistant. She was a professional daughter with a title. That was the appetizer. Now for the main course. As the wife of a senior partner at Ethelredge and Thorne Design, I had access to the family financial portal. Mark always complained about the quarterly reports. I always read them. I logged in. The firm wasn't just struggling, it was suffocating. They were leveraged to the absolute limit, drowning in debt, and they had bet the entire company their pensions, their partnerships on landing Eleanor's River North project. This wasn't just infidelity, this was desperation. Next, the corporate American Express account. We linked our cards for convenience, so I could help him categorize his expenses for the accountant. I opened the statement. It was a roadmap of his affair, charge after charge at the peninsula, dinners at Gibson's that cost more than our mortgage payment, a steady stream of private car services, and every single line item was meticulously, arrogantly labeled T&E Vance Project, travel and entertainment. He was certainly entertaining. I sorted the file by date. The first charge was 6 months ago. 6 months. The clinical coldness in my veins began to burn. I pushed it down. Data first. Emotion later. I remembered the phone. About 3 months ago, he'd brought home a new burner phone. Client security. He'd snapped when I asked. Eleanor is paranoid about leaks. He kept it in his old briefcase in the back of our shared closet. I retrieved it. It was powered on. The lock screen demanded a 6-digit passcode. Mark was a creature of habit, arrogant and lazy. I typed in the birthday of our 7-year-old daughter, Maya. The phone unlocked on the first try. My breath hitched. It wasn't just text messages. It was videos. And worse, far worse, it was audio recordings. My hand was shaking now, but I pressed play on the most recent file. I heard his voice, not the stressed, tired voice he used at home, but one that was smug and relaxed. "The old dragon actually bought the entire pitch," he was saying, and I heard the clink of ice in a glass. Then Chloe's voice, high and thin. "Of course she did. Marky, she thinks you're a god. Just get her to sign the main contract." "And then," he prompted. "And then," she giggled, "you finally dump that boring, frigid wife of yours. I get my allowance from Mom for bringing in the deal, and we are on a beach in Bora Bora." "She's not a dragon, babe," Mark said, his voice dropping. "She's our ATM, and she has no idea her own daughter is the key." "She will," Chloe said, "and she'll hate it. She'll hate us. It will be perfect." I listened to every single file, every plan, every disgusting pet name. Every time they mocked Eleanor, every detail of how they would spend the allowance Mark would get from Chloe after he landed the contract and filed for divorce. I sat there in the silence of my office for a long time. The tears I expected didn't come. The grief I thought I would feel was absent. There was only a profound Arctic stillness. I pulled my encrypted client drive from my desk drawer. I plugged it into the burner phone. I plugged it into my laptop. I copied everything. The background check, the firm's financials, the Amex statements, every video, every audio file. I created 3 separate, redundant backups. I was no longer crying. I was planning. I didn't call Mark. His panic wasn't a resource I was ready to tap. I certainly didn't call Chloe. She was a pawn. And you never address the pawn when the queen is on the board. Instead, at 9 a.m. the next morning, I called the private, unlisted number for Eleanor Vance's personal office. When her executive assistant answered, I didn't introduce myself as Sloane, Mark's wife. I used my professional credentials. "This is Sloane Ethelredge, lead strategist at Brand Acuity Consulting. I am calling to request an urgent off-the-books consultation with Mrs. Vance regarding a mutual interest and a severe fiduciary risk located within the Ethelredge and Thorne Design Group." The jargon worked. The gatekeeper saw me not as a personal problem, but as a fellow professional bringing a crisis. A meeting was set for 2 hours later. We met at the Clarion Club, a place so old money and discreet that the walls seemed to absorb sound. Neutral territory, a power player's move, and I recognized she had chosen it to put me on the defensive. I arrived 10 minutes early. She arrived exactly on time. Eleanor Vance in person was far more formidable than her Forbes cover. She wore a steel gray suit that looked custom-made, and her eyes held no warmth whatsoever. She didn't offer a handshake. "You have 30 minutes, Ms. Ethelredge," she said, her voice like gravel. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I didn't cry. I didn't mention the restaurant, my marriage, or my pain. I treated it as a pitch. I laid out the facts, my voice even and clinical. I placed a single file on the polished mahogany table between us. "Exhibit A," I said. A 6-month statement from a corporate American Express card assigned to Mark Ethelredge, detailing expenditures at the Peninsula, Gibson's, and various luxury retailers, all coded to your project. I slid the first page across. She glanced at it, her expression unreadable. "Exhibit B, hotel folios and car service receipts, cross-referencing the dates of those charges. As you can see, the expenses are consistently personal, not professional." I pushed the second stack. Her gaze sharpened, but she remained silent. "And Exhibit C?" I said. I placed the small burner phone on the table. "An audio file. I believe the contents concern you directly." I pressed play. I had cued it to the exact moment. We sat in the heavy silence of the private room, listening to Mark's voice, smug and superior. The old dragon actually bought the entire pitch. I watched Eleanor. A lesser woman would have flinched, her anger a visible fire. Eleanor's face became a mask of ice, but I saw a single muscle in her jaw clench, a small, violent pulse just beneath the skin. That was the rage. We listened as Chloe's voice detailed the allowance, and Mark's voice reduced Eleanor to an ATM. I stopped the recording. "This is not about my husband's infidelity, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice quiet but cutting. "That is a personal matter I will handle. This is about your $500 million project. He is not just cheating on me. He is actively using your daughter as a compromised asset to defraud your project. She is a willing co-conspirator, and both of them view you as the mark." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantelpiece was the only sound. "This project," she finally said, her voice dangerously low, "is not just an investment. It is my legacy. My name will be on the cornerstone. Based on your husband's leadership and his fraudulent presentations, I have already sunk $20 million in non-recoverable pre-development costs." The number hung in the air. 20 million. This was bigger than I thought. The risk was exponentially higher, which meant her willingness to act would be, too. "He has compromised you, Mrs. Vance," I stated, "and he has compromised your daughter. When this implodes, and it will, the narrative will be that you were either duped by a mid-level architect or, worse, that you were aware of his methods. Your legacy will be a scandal." She looked at me, her eyes finally showing a flicker of something new respect. "What do you propose?" Here it was, the pivot. "You need a new narrative," I said, leaning forward. "Mark is a liability. You need to cut him out, but you need to do it surgically, in a way that protects your 20 million and your name. I can provide the strategy for that narrative." "And what is in it for you, Ms. Ethelred?" He took my name. He risked my daughter's future. He built his career on my support. I am not interested in alimony. Mrs. Vance, I am interested in erasure. This requires that we operate in parallel. You destroy his career from the outside. I will destroy his life from the inside." A slow, cold smile touched the corner of Eleanor Vance's mouth. It didn't reach her eyes. "Parallel," she repeated. "I like that. He's a liability. You are an asset." She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Handle your side, Ms. Ethelred. I will handle mine." The alliance was formed. Mark came home that night, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the glass. I was in the kitchen, packing a lunch for Maya, my movements calm and domestic. He threw his briefcase onto the antique console table, a clear violation of the no-clutter rule he himself had established. "That woman is insane," he announced, yanking his tie loose. "Hard day, honey?" I asked, my voice pitched with the perfect blend of sympathy and wifely concern. "Hard day, Sloane. She's on a warpath. Eleanor Vance. The meeting was a disaster. She's nickel and diming every line item, ripping into financials she has no business ripping into." He poured himself a large scotch, skipping the ice. He was agitated, his arrogance pricked. He hadn't suspected a thing at the restaurant. He'd left with Chloe and Eleanor 20 minutes after I'd raised my glass, too consumed by his own lies to see the declaration of war I had just issued. "I'm so sorry, darling," I said, coming over to rub his shoulders. He was tense, coiled like a spring. "She's just stressed. It's a huge project." "You'll figure it out." "You always do." He grunted, leaning into my touch. "Yeah, I just need to get her to sign. Just get the damn thing over the line." I smiled into his back. "I know you will." The controlled demolition began exactly 2 days later. Eleanor, true to her word, had moved decisively. Mark's phone rang at 7 in the morning, a call he took in our bedroom, his voice escalating from confused to furious. "What do you mean? An emergency meeting. I am the lead on this project." "Fine. I'll be there by 8. He came home that afternoon a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a gray, ashen fear. He was panicked. "She's pulling the funding," he said, his voice hollow as he stood in the middle of our pristine living room. "What, Mark? Who?" "Eleanor. She's paused all funding, effective immediately. She sent a letter to the partners citing grave concerns regarding leadership and financial oversight. And she's demanding a full external audit. I put my hand to my chest in mock horror. An audit. But why? What could she possibly find? Nothing, he yelled, suddenly defensive. It's a power play. She's trying to get a bigger piece of the project. That's all. And my partners. Those cowards. They're folding. They're letting her do it. He spent the next 48 hours in his home office, a place he rarely used, gathering his files. He was trying to get his story straight. I played the part of the supportive, terrified wife perfectly. I brought him coffee. I made him meals he didn't touch. And I watched. "Let me help you." "Mark," I offered, sitting down at his desk as he frantically sorted through piles of receipts. "My God, these expenses are a mess. We need to get these organized before the auditors see them." The audit firm Eleanor had chosen was, of course, the one I had suggested in our meeting. Kroll and Associates. They weren't just accountants, they were bloodhounds. They were the firm corporations hired when they wanted to send someone to prison. Mark, in his professional bubble, just saw them as an expensive annoyance. He had no idea what was coming. "They won't understand these," he muttered, holding a receipt from the peninsula. This was a strategy dinner. This was client development. I watched him as the lie formed. He was trying to figure out how to hide the 6 months of hotel rooms and $1,000 dinners with Chloe. I knew every charge he was looking at. I had already memorized the Amex statements. "He's going to try and recategorize," I'd told Eleanor. "He's too arrogant to think he'll get caught. He'll just move the data." "Then we must give him a bucket to put it in," she had replied. "Now." I put my hand on his. "Mark, you're right. Travel and entertainment looks so frivolous. The auditors will just jump on that. Why don't you create a new subcategory for them? Something that sounds more official. Something that justifies the expense." He looked at me, a flicker of his old admiration in his eyes. "Like what?" I pretended to think, tapping my chin. "Something like client relations development. It sounds strategic. It sounds like part of the Vance project's core budget. You can just move all those sensitive dinners right under that heading. It's clean." He seized on it. "Client relations development. That's brilliant. Sloan. God, that's brilliant. It's exactly what it was." I watched him spend the next 2 hours creating the digital folder, meticulously moving every single incriminating charge into the brand new category. He was practically humming. He was building his own gallows, and I was handing him the nails. I knew, from my own research into Kroll's methods, that the first thing a forensic auditor searches for isn't an expense. It's a pattern. And nothing screams guilty like a brand new, heavily funded accounting category created the day before an audit begins. "See," I said, smiling at him. "All bundled up. They'll probably skip right over it." Mark was drowning. The auditors from Kroll and Associates had set up a war room at the Ethelredge and Thorne offices, and Mark was chained to it. He was home late, if at all, smelling of stale coffee and pure, uncut panic. While he was being buried alive under requests for justifications and timelines, I executed Phase 2. This was no longer about proving the affair. The burner phone had already done that. This was about leverage. This was about dismantling his entire professional identity so thoroughly that he would have nothing left to fight me with. Our lives were digitized and synced. We had a shared cloud server for our taxes, our wills, Maya's school records, and what Mark called his professional portfolio. It was a repository of his past projects, his accolades, his entire career packaged for public consumption. I logged in from my office, the password, like the phone. Laughably simple, his college football jersey number. The portfolio folder was organized, polished, and full of lies. But I wasn't interested in the public-facing files. I was looking for the architecture behind the facade. I ran a search for hidden files, for archival folders, for anything he thought he had deleted. A single password-protected zip file appeared. Its name was Vance Concepts Archive. My heart hammered. He was arrogant, but he was also a paranoid narcissist. He would never delete what he considered his genius work. He'd just hide it. I tried Maya's birthday. Nothing. I tried our anniversary. Nothing. I tried his own birthday. The file unzipped. It wasn't a folder. It was dozens. Inside were raw design files, sketches, and conceptual renderings. I opened the first one. It was a beautiful, fluid design for a cantilevered park space. I recognized it instantly. It was the centerpiece of the River North pitch, the hero shot that had supposedly won Eleanor over, but the file's metadata told a different story. The author tag didn't say Mark Ethelredge. It said Kenji Tanaka. Kenji was a junior architect at the firm, barely 25, brilliant, and quiet. I opened another file, a revolutionary mixed-use residential concept. Author Sarah Chen, another junior designer. I went through them one by one. The entire $500 million Vance project, the pitch that had made Mark the savior of the firm, was a lie. He hadn't just taken inspiration. He had stolen, wholesale, the most innovative ideas from the youngest, most vulnerable architects at his company. He had packaged their work, put his name on the cover, and presented it as his own. My rage was so cold it felt like a physical weight. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had betrayed his entire profession. I began to work, my movements fast and precise. I copied every file. I took screenshots of the metadata, the creation dates, the file modification histories. I cross-referenced them with Mark's official presentation calendar. The timeline was damning. Kenji's file was created on March 10th. Mark presented it to Eleanor as his own on March 15th. It was open and shut intellectual property theft. This was the weapon. This was the leverage that went beyond the personal. This was career annihilation. I was about to log out when my eye caught another part of the cloud directory. His synced email. I had never spied on his email. It had always felt like a line I wouldn't cross. That line was now a scorched crater behind me. I opened his drafts folder. There was only one. It was addressed to Chloe. The subject line was soon. It was scheduled to be sent 1 week from today. My dearest C, it began. The final piece is falling into place. The first tranche check from Vance clears on Friday. As soon as it's in the A&T account, I'm pulling the trigger. I'm filing. I'll be out of the house by Monday. My lawyer has the entire strategy ready. I'm hitting her with the unstable mother angle. Your intel about her obsession with work was perfect. We'll use a private investigator to document her hours, prove she puts her job before Maya. By the time she knows what's happening, I'll have filed for emergency temporary custody. She won't stand a chance. She'll be too busy fighting for scraps to fight for the money. We'll be in Bora Bora before the month is out. You and me? Finally. I read it 3 times. The room went silent. The sound of my own breathing was deafening. He was going to use our daughter. He was going to take my child. He was going to paint me as an unfit mother-me, the one who packed her lunches, who read her the bedtime stories, who held her during fevers while he was at strategy dinners at the peninsula. The audio recordings were betrayal. The stolen designs were fraud. This was a declaration of total war. He had just given me permission to burn his entire world to the ground, and I suddenly had the match, the gasoline, and the blueprint to the house. The email draft detailing the custody attack had reset the stakes. This was no longer a negotiation. It was an extraction. The following morning, I took my encrypted hard drive now loaded with the financial audit, the stolen intellectual property files, and the Bora Bora custody plan to the offices of Hannah Reese. Hannah is not the lawyer you hire to amicably uncouple. She is the lawyer Chicago's most powerful women hire when they need to conduct a hostile takeover of their own lives. She has a 75th floor office that overlooks the entire city and a reputation for financially neutering opponents before they've even had their morning coffee. I sat in her glass-walled conference room as she reviewed the evidence on a secure monitor. She was silent as she listened to the audio recordings of Mark and Chloe mocking Eleanor. She nodded with clinical appreciation as she scanned the metadata timeline of Kenji Tanaka's stolen designs. But when she read the scheduled Bora Bora email, the one outlining the plan to paint me as an unstable, work-obsessed mother to steal Maya, she looked up. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She was, in that moment, absolutely gleeful. "He put it in writing," she whispered, as if savoring a fine wine. "The monumental, arrogant fool. He documented his own conspiracy to commit parental alienation and fraud. Sloane, this isn't a divorce. This is a vivisection." "What's the first move?" I asked, my voice flat. "We don't file for divorce," she said, already tapping instructions to her associates. "Not yet. Filing alerts him, and he'll start moving the money. First, we file an emergency ex parte petition for financial preservation based on the evidence of marital asset dissipation. That's the $150,000 in T&E and the clear intent to defraud. We are going to freeze every joint account, every credit line, and every investment vehicle he has access to. By the time he finds out, his signature will be worthless." Within 90 minutes, her team was at the courthouse. I left her office and went to a different bank, a private institution where I had no established history. I opened 2 new accounts, funded by the immediate liquidation of my own premarital stocks. This was the portfolio I had built in my 20s, long before I met Mark. It was my independence, and it would now become my war chest. My next stop was tactical. Mark was going to attack my motherhood. I had to build a fortress. I had scheduled an appointment with a renowned child psychologist, Dr. Alani. The official reason I gave her office was consultation regarding school transition anxiety. I spent an hour with the doctor. I didn't mention Mark. I didn't mention a divorce. I talked only about Maya, her routines, her friendships, her love of drawing, her frustration with math. I detailed our bedtime ritual, the 3 books rule, the silly song we sang on the way to school. Dr. Alani observed Maya and me interacting in her playroom, documenting our easy, familiar dynamic. "Mrs. Ethelredge," she said at the end, closing her file. "Maya is one of the most secure, well-adjusted 7-year-olds I've seen this quarter. She's bright, deeply bonded to you, and shows 0 markers for any significant anxiety. Whatever you're doing, it's working." I paid in cash. The report was time-stamped, an objective, third-party baseline of my maternal care, established before a single accusation could be leveled. I had fortified my finances and my status as a mother. Now, I needed to secure my career. I began quietly reaching out to my network, planting the seeds for new contracts, but the most important call came to me. It was a senior partner from Kroll and Associates, the audit firm currently dissecting Mark's life. "Ms. Ethelredge," the partner said, his voice clipped and serious. "I'm calling on a confidential matter. We are conducting a high-stakes audit for Vance Capital. I'm told you are the best in Chicago for brand reputation and crisis communications." My blood ran cold and hot at the same time. I handle sensitive situations, yes. Our client, Mrs. Vance, was acting on an anonymous tip regarding fiduciary discrepancies at Ethelredge and Thorne. That tip proved to be extraordinarily accurate. Our preliminary findings suggest fraud that is both deep and systemic. When our report is finalized, the firm will likely collapse. It will be catastrophic. "Eleanor," I thought, "you magnificent surgeon." "The problem," he continued, "is that Vance Capital's name is attached to this. We need someone to manage the narrative. We need to insulate our client from the public implosion of her chosen architectural firm. Eleanor Vance recommended you personally. She cited your uncompromising ethical clarity." The irony was exquisite. Mark was, at that very moment, sitting in a conference room lying to an auditor from Kroll, and I, his wife, was being hired by that same firm to write the public execution script for his fraud. Eleanor wasn't just my ally, she had made me her paid proxy. "I understand the situation perfectly," I said. my voice a mask of professional calm. "Please send over the retainer agreement. I can start immediately." Mark's world had contracted to the four walls of a conference room at the A&T offices, where the Kroll auditors were systematically dismantling his career. My world, conversely, was expanding at a geometric rate. The chaos at Ethelredge and Thorne was palpable. The audit, which I was now advising Kroll on under the guise of crisis communications strategy, was even more devastating than I had planned. It hadn't just exposed Mark. It had exposed the entire firm's lazy, arrogant culture. Partners were turning on each other, digging up old emails to shift blame, frantically trying to distance themselves from Mark, who was now universally recognized as the plague carrier. He was the target. He was the fall guy. While Mark was desperately trying to justify a $20,000 suite at the Peninsula as a client necessity, I was executing the largest contract of my professional life. My work for Kroll, funded entirely by Vance Capital, was to draft the internal and external communication strategy for the inevitable collapse. I was, in essence, writing the obituary for my husband's firm while he was still sitting in its dying body. But that work was quiet, confidential. I needed a public-facing victory. I needed to pivot my own brand, separating the Ethelredge name from the toxic mess Mark had created. I spent 2 nights, fueled by a cold, precise anger, drafting an article. I didn't send it to a blog. I sent it directly to the op-ed editor of the Chicago Business Chronicle. The title was "The Brand of Trust Fiduciary Responsibility as the New Cornerstone in Real Estate Development." It never mentioned Mark. It never mentioned Ethelredge and Thorne. It was far more damning. It was a clinical, brilliant evisceration of his entire operational philosophy. I wrote about the profound, catastrophic brand damage that occurs when firms elevate visionary personalities above transparent accounting. I detailed the risk of allowing client relations to become a shadow budget for personal gratification. I laid out a new framework for absolute integrity. It was published 48 hours later. The online response was immediate. My professional inbox, which I had firewalled from my personal life, exploded. I had calls from rival developers, from heads of finance, from other PR firms, all congratulating me on my bold and necessary stance. I had defined the scandal before it had even fully broken, and I had positioned myself as the solution to it. Among the flood of emails was one from the organizers of the annual Women in Leadership Summit, Chicago's premier event for female executives. "Given the extraordinary clarity of your recent article," it read, "we believe your voice is essential. We would be honored if you would join our Future of the City panel." I accepted. I had, of course, already checked the event's speakers list. I knew exactly who was giving the keynote address. The day of the summit, the ballroom was packed with over 500 of the city's most powerful women. I wore a cobalt blue sheath dress that was the visual equivalent of a steel blade. I sat on my panel, speaking calmly about the mathematics of trust and the ROI of accountability. I knew that, at that exact moment, Mark was in a 7-hour non-stop deposition with Kroll's legal team. After our panel concluded, the moderator stepped to the podium. And now, it is my profound honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a woman who needs no introduction, the matriarch of the Chicago skyline, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor owned the stage. She was magnificent, a silver-haired titan in a charcoal suit. She spoke of concrete and steel, of legacy and the future. And then, she opened the floor to questions. A hand shot up in the front row, a journalist from the Chronicle, the very one who had championed my article. It was the moment. The spontaneous beat Eleanor and I had choreographed over a single 3-minute phone call. "Mrs. Vance," the journalist asked, "your speech is about the future, but your most high-profile current project, River North, seems to be stalled amid rumors of serious trouble at your partner firm, Ethelredge and Thorne. How do you protect your brand from that kind of association?" A hush fell over the room. This was the question everyone wanted to ask. Eleanor smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "That is the essential question. Isn't it you protect your brand by refusing to partner with compromised assets? The old boys club model of backroom deals and rainmakers who spend more than they earn is over. It is a liability, and I do not tolerate liabilities. She paused, scanning the audience, as if a new thought had just occurred to her. In fact, I was just reading an extraordinary article on this very subject. It was written by one of your own panelists today, Ms. Sloane Ethelredge. Every head in the ballroom swiveled to me. I met their gazes, my expression one of polite, professional interest. Ms. Ethelredge's piece on fiduciary responsibility, Eleanor boomed, her voice amplified by the microphone, was the single most lucid articulation of modern business ethics I have read this decade. She argues that a brand's integrity is its only true asset. She is absolutely correct. She looked directly at me, a queen acknowledging a peer. That is why, Eleanor announced, turning back to the breathless room. Vance Capital is making her philosophy our new policy. I am thrilled to announce that we are retaining Ms. Ethelredge's consulting firm, effective immediately, to advise on all future projects. Her standard of uncompromising ethical clarity will now be the benchmark for anyone who wishes to do business with me. The room erupted in applause. It was a coronation. In one 30-second move, Eleanor had publicly anointed me, legitimized my career separate from Mark's, and definitively cut him and his entire firm adrift. She had confirmed their fate and handed me their future. The Kroll report was a bloodbath. It landed on the desks of the Ethelredge and Thorne partners with the thud of a tombstone. The findings were clinical, precise, and absolutely apocalyptic. $150,000 in client relations development had been forensically linked to suites at the Peninsula, jewelry from Tiffany's, and dinners for two. The metadata from the Vance Concepts archive was laid bare, proving conclusively that Mark's award-winning designs were stolen, file by file from junior staff. The firm was in a death spiral. Eleanor Vance's legal team had filed an official suit for $20 million in damages for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, an internal revolt was brewing as word of the stolen intellectual property spread. The firm was hemorrhaging. Mark, backed into a corner and with his assets frozen by my lawyer's quiet petition, did exactly what I predicted he would. A cornered rat always looks for someone weaker to bite. He called an emergency meeting with the remaining partners, his last pathetic attempt to control the narrative. I wasn't there, but I had a source inside the room, a terrified junior partner who had reached out to my consultancy firm, desperate to build his own reputational lifeboat. He relayed the entire scene to me an hour later. Mark, my source said, had been pathetic. He was hollow-eyed and shaking, but he delivered the speech he'd been rehearsing. It was all Chloe. She was unstable, he claimed. She had seduced him, using her mother's power as leverage. She had demanded the gifts, the hotels. She was a security risk, he'd insisted, who had compromised his professional judgment. He painted himself as the victim, a loyal partner who had been tragically manipulated by a cunning, ambitious young woman. She was the one, he'd pleaded, his voice cracking. Who had access to the server? She must have been the one who misfiled those T&E expenses. I was trying to protect the firm from her influence. The partners, desperate for any narrative that didn't involve their own catastrophic lack of oversight, seized it. They saw their escape hatch. They could paint Mark as a single, compromised actor. They would fire him, publicly, for cause, due to an inappropriate and compromising relationship with a client's representative. They would offer him up to Eleanor as a sacrifice, pinning the entire $150,000 fraud on his personal weakness and Chloe's manipulation. They would disavow his actions, issue a public apology, and beg for mercy. They finished the meeting. Mark was to be terminated in the morning. He thought he had just saved them. He thought he was just a scapegoat. He was wrong. I had anticipated his every move. His misogyny was as predictable as his passwords. The night before that scapegoat meeting, I had placed a call. I didn't go to a reputable journalist. I went to the most notorious, sharp-fanged gossip columnist in Chicago business, a woman named Maureen Dowd, who lived to dismantle the reputations of powerful men. I sent her a single, password-protected audio file. "You'll want to run this in the morning," I'd said. "It's a scoop on the Ethelred and Thorne implosion." The story broke at 6 a.m. It wasn't buried in the business section. It was the digital front-page splash. The headline was brutal. "The ATM and the architect leaked audio reveals the rotten core of A&T's genius." The article was pure venom. It published a full, unedited transcript of the burner phone recording. The world now heard Mark and Chloe, in their own smug voices, calling Eleanor Vance the old dragon. The world heard them laughing about her as their ATM. The world heard their entire giddy plan to use her money to fund their affair. The narrative I had handed Maureen wasn't about a dry audit. It was a juicy, lurid story of sex, lies, and profound, unapologetic misogyny. Mark woke up to a firestorm. He wasn't just a scapegoat for financial mismanagement anymore. He was a public relations liability of the highest order. He was toxic. The partners at Ethelred and Thorne, who had been huddled together just hours before, ready to look strong by firing him, now looked like the biggest fools in Chicago. They looked weak, complicit, and utterly incompetent. The story made it clear they had either fostered this culture of sexism and fraud, or they were too stupid to see it happening under their own roof. There was no scapegoat plan left. You can't sacrifice an asset that has already detonated, taking the entire building with it. He was radioactive. No one would touch him. His fall was complete. The termination was not a meeting. It was an execution. Mark wasn't just fired. He was terminated for cause. A brutal, precise legal term. The cause was gross misconduct, willful fraud, and actions that brought catastrophic reputational damage to the firm. This specific phrasing meant he lost everything. His partnership stake was voided. He had no severance package. He lost his health insurance, effective immediately. He was escorted out of the building by security, carrying a single cardboard box. He arrived home in the late afternoon, just as the November light was beginning to fade, turning the city gray. I heard his key in the lock. I was waiting. He walked into the living room, his face slack-jawed and pale. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He saw me and seemed to sag with a desperate, pathetic relief. "Sloane," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Thank God. You won't believe what they did. What she did. Eleanor, they fired me. They took everything. We've lost it all. Sloane, we have to stick together. We're all we have left. Me, you, and Maya. We have to fight them together." He finally looked around the room. It was only then that he noticed the emptiness. The rug was gone. The paintings I had inherited from my grandmother were off the walls. The bookshelves were bare. All my personal effects, everything that had made this house our home, had been moved into storage over the past 3 days while he was in his audit depositions. All that remained was his heavy, masculine furniture. He turned back to me. I was sitting on the sofa he had picked out, the one I had always hated. I was not alone. To my left sat Hannah Reese, my lawyer, her leather briefcase open on her lap. To my right sat a large, impassive man in a nondescript suit, a court process server. Mark's confusion curdled into fear. "Sloane, what is this? Who are these people?" I looked at him, my expression as empty as the room. "You haven't lost everything. Mark, you still have her?" The process server stood up. He was holding a thick stack of manila envelopes. "Mark Ethelred," he asked, his voice booming in the quiet room. Mark just stared, frozen. "You have been served," the man said. He handed the first, thickest envelope to Mark, who took it with a numb, trembling hand. "That," Hannah Reese said, her voice sharp and clear, "is a petition for the dissolution of your marriage." The process server handed him a second envelope. "You have been served." "That," Hannah continued, is an emergency temporary restraining order, granting my client sole physical and legal custody of your daughter and requiring you to vacate this property immediately. The petition was granted based on documented evidence of a conspiracy to commit parental alienation and threaten abduction. The Bora Bora email was quite compelling. Mark's face went white. Abduction, I would never. Sloan, you can't. The server handed him a third envelope. You have been served. And that, Hannah said, is the official court order, signed this morning, ratifying the emergency freeze on all your joint marital assets, pending a full forensic review of the $150,000 you dissipated on your mistress. Mistress Sloan, it wasn't. I was manipulated, he pleaded, his voice cracking. He looked at me, his eyes wild. You won't get away with this. I'll fight you. I'll fight you for Maya. I'll tell them what you're really like, you cold, work-obsessed. He stopped. Hannah Reese had simply lifted her smartphone from her lap. She pressed a single button. My voice filled the room, from the audio recording of the psychologist's report. Dr. Alani, she's bright, deeply bonded to you, and shows zero markers for any significant anxiety. Then, Hannah switched the file, Mark's own voice, smug and confident, from the burner phone. I'm hitting her with the unstable mother angle. We'll use a private investigator. I'll have filed for emergency temporary custody. She won't stand a chance. Mark went silent. He looked utterly broken. Wait, he whispered, looking at the process server. You're not done. The server, who had been waiting patiently, held up 2 more envelopes. One was thin. One was very, very thick. Mark Ethelredge, the server said again. You have been served. He handed Mark the thick envelope. What is that? Mark whispered. That, I said, speaking for the first time since he'd walked in, is a civil lawsuit for intellectual property theft, filed by Kenji Tanaka and Sarah Chen. They've retained an excellent lawyer. Apparently, some anonymous patron of the arts heard about their case and is funding the entire litigation. They are suing you personally for damages and loss of career. Mark was swaying, clutching the papers to his chest. He looked at the last final envelope in the server's hand. Mark Ethelredge, the server said, his voice betraying no emotion. You have been served. He handed the last file to Mark. And that, I finished, standing up and smoothing my skirt, is a summons from the legal team at Vance Capital. Eleanor is naming you, personally, in a $20 million civil fraud suit. I watched him. In the span of about 90 seconds, he had lost his job, his home, his wife, his child, and was now facing 3 separate, unwinnable lawsuits with no assets to pay a lawyer. The restraining order gives you 20 minutes to gather your personal effects, Hannah said, snapping her briefcase shut. I've taken the liberty of calling you a car. This wasn't 6 months later. This was the final battle, waged in a sterile, gray-walled mediation room that smelled of stale coffee and defeat. Mark was a ghost. He sat slumped in his chair, wearing a suit that was now too large for him. He was broke, a pariah, and flanked by a public defender who looked overwhelmed. The simultaneous lawsuits had bled him dry. His only remaining hope, the last pathetic straw he could grasp, was to try and extract something, anything, from me. His lawyer began, his voice reedy. Mr. Ethelredge is, in fact, the true victim here. He was under immense professional pressure, targeted by an unstable heiress, Ms. Vance, and manipulated by her romantic overtures. He was operating under the undue influence of her mother, Eleanor Vance, a woman whose power in this city is... Hannah Reese didn't even let him finish. She didn't sigh. She didn't argue. She simply lifted her briefcase onto the table and produced a binder. It was 5 inches thick, bound in black. She dropped it. The sound it made on the polished wood was definitive, like a gavel. The victim, Hannah said, her voice cutting through the room, was meticulous in documenting his victimization. She opened the binder. Exhibit A, the American Express statements totaling over $150,000 in dissipated marital assets. Exhibit B, the metadata and timelines proving the theft of Mr. Tanaka's and Ms. Chen's designs. Exhibit C, the audio recordings from the burner phone. Exhibit D, the sworn affidavit from the child psychologist. Exhibit E, when the mediator, a weary, retired judge, finally held up his hand, stopping her. He looked at Mark's pale, trembling lawyer. He looked at the mountain of evidence. He looked at Mark. "Counselor," the mediator said, his voice void of sympathy. "My strong recommendation to your client is that he accept the first offer. Whatever it is, take it." Hannah slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "The offer is not complex," she said. "Ms. Ethelredge receives 100% of the marital home. She retains sole physical and legal custody of their daughter, Maya. Mr. Ethelredge will be granted supervised visitation, contingent upon his full and successful completion of a court-mandated parental ethics and cooperation course. He will waive all present and future claims on Ms. Ethelredge's business, income, and personal assets." Mark's lawyer scanned the page. "And in exchange?" "In exchange," Hannah said, "my client will not file a fourth civil suit against your client for his fraudulent dissipation of their estate. We are, however, making no promises regarding the criminal referrals for fraud that Ethelredge and Thorne may choose to pursue." It was the contingent visitation that broke him. "No." "So," Mark suddenly yelled, his voice cracking. He tried to stand, but only managed a weak half-crouch. "She's not taking my daughter. She's not. That's my house. I built that house. I was the victim." I raised a single hand. Hannah stopped. The room fell silent. I reached into my own portfolio. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a press release I had drafted myself. I slid it across the table. It stopped directly in front of him. He stared at it. The headline was clean and devastating. "How Mark Ethelredge Built a Career on Stolen Ideas and Seduction." Below it, in crisp bullet points, was a summary of the Kroll report. It listed the names of the junior architects he had stolen from. It listed the exact audited dollar amount he had spent on Chloe. It was factual, sharp, perfect, and absolutely indefensible. He looked up from the paper, his eyes finally showing a complete, bottomless terror. "That," I said, my voice quiet, "is a proof copy. If you do not sign that term sheet in the next 60 seconds, this document goes live. It will be sent to every major newspaper and business journal in this city. A personal, hard copy will be messengered directly to your parents in Ohio." I leaned forward. "This is not a negotiation. Mark, this is an editorial review. Sign the terms, or I approve the final print." I watched the last ounce of arrogance, the last flicker of the man who had sat at the ledge, drain out of him. He was nothing. A hollowed-out shell. He fumbled for the pen on the table, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grasp it. He, finally and completely, signed. I stood up. Hannah closed her binder. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I didn't look back at the ruin I had left sitting at the table. I just walked out,